Hi there, and welcome to my self-presentation. Let's get started. So we're going to have a do now called In Their Shoes, and you guys are going to try out something that is required in the self-assessment. One section of this assessment is called Recalling Sentences, and this section requires the child to imitate sentences presented by the examiner. This tests the child's ability to recall and reproduce sentences of varying length and complexity. So the do now is to work with the person next to you. Partner one is going to create a long and complicated sentence and then read it to their partner. The sentence example that I gave is, "The splendid giraffe moved his elongated neck towards the shining sun in one swift and careless motion, causing quite a stir in the trees." Partner two, your job is to repeat the sentence. Afterwards, we're going to share if the task was hard, how it made you feel, and what kind of students you think take this assessment. So go ahead and do that now. All right, so what is the self-assessment? The clinical evaluation of language fundamentals, or the CELF-5, was designated to assess a student's language and communication skills in a variety of contexts, determine the presence of a language disorder, describe the nature of the language disorder, and plan for intervention or treatment. So basically, we're trying to figure out if a child has language or speech needs and what we can do to help them. The test identifies a student's language strengths and weaknesses and can be used to determine eligibility for services, curriculum planning, recommend classroom language adaptations or accommodations, and provide performance-based assessment that corresponds to educational objectives. The CELF-5 screening test helps quickly determine if a student needs further testing to identify a language disorder. It consists of a number of tests that can each be administered as an independent test. There are 16 of them, and the price ranges from $906.25 to $1,393.50 depending on the kit that you get. The cheapest option comes in an online format through something called Q Global. The test is also available in languages other than English, such as Spanish. All right. So here you guys can see an overview of the CELF-5 assessment model. It basically goes through figuring out if a child has a language disorder, what are you going to do about it, how are you going to assess them. So the first box is a language disorder affecting classroom performance? You're going to evaluate them in their classroom and otherwise, and you're going to figure out your next steps. So if a student does not respond to a variety of classroom interventions, is performance due to a language disorder? You're going to administer the core language test for their age level, and then moving forward, if a language disorder is not identified, I guess then that's another story, but in the case that it is identified, we go on to what do I need to know to plan for intervention. So you identify the nature of the disorder and you figure out what questions you need to answer to best help this child. So the 4 questions that they provided are there significant differences in comprehension and expression? How does the disorder affect written language? Are there weaknesses in the area of morphosyntax or semantics? Does the disorder affect social interactions? So depending on if you answer yes or no to these questions, you'll administer different tests to the child. Then finally, based on all of your assessment information, you figure out what is the best way to address the student's needs. It's kind of a nice model. Puts it all there for you. So before the CELF-5, there was the CELF-4, which was phased out completely in December of 2018. And there were a couple changes from the CELF-4 to the CELF-5, so they're written down here, but I'm also going to read them to you. So the CELF 5 has additional literacy tests for reading and writing comprehension. It has updated instructions and forms, which makes it easier to administer. It has reconstructed testing and scoring to reduce time spent by the administrator, new images and language to represent the current student population. Current demographic information and population was used for normative data, which improves the scoring. Expanded digital options, like I was talking about before, through Q Global, and improved scoring methods to track student progress. So the CELF 4, there was no way to see if there was student growth if they took the test once and took it again, and so now they have a way to track it, which is very helpful. So the population assessed with the CELF 5 are those students who may have a speech or language disorder or certain deficits in language. And the test can be administered for children aged 5 through 21 years and 11 months old, although only ages 9 to 21 are administered the metalinguistic section. So it is a very large range that can take the test. So, as always, there was a population used to norm test, and according to Corey and McCrimmon, standardization occurred in the United States from March to December 2012 on a sample of 3,250 English-speaking 5 to 21-year-olds, representative of the U.S. population in 47 states. And the sample was stratified or broken up according to age, geographical region, and the caregiver's education. A small percentage of participants had a disability in some aspect. So, how is the CELF administered and who administers it? The CELF 5 can be administered by speech and language pathologists, school psychologists, special educators, and qualified diagnosticians with a master's degree or certification in standardized testing. The test can be completed within 30 to 45 minutes if it's the core test, or if you're taking the full test, it can take 90 to 120 minutes. So the CELF 5 authors recommend the initial use of the observational rating scale, which we'll talk about in the next slide, to identify areas of concern, followed by administration of relevant tests to determine the existence and nature of a language deficit. This process allows for a flexible and comprehensive assessment, as subtests can be administered individually to assess specific language skills or for a comprehensive language evaluation. Tripping over my words, but it's okay. Alright, so the test uses verbal responses to picture stimuli, and I'm going to go through all 16 subtests and describe what you do for each, but we'll talk about it a little bit here. So after demonstrating how to do a task, the test administrator will ask the students to do the same task, but they'll do it with different content. So this means that, for example, the administrator can show the student a picture and ask them a question about the picture. Like, they'll show them a picture of an outdoor scene and say, point to the sun. And if the student points to the sun, they move on. But if not, the administrator will demonstrate pointing to the sun and then move on. So that's an example of testing for sentence comprehension, because the student needs to know what the administrator is asking them to do so that they can point to the correct word or object. Another example would be showing a student a page with multiple pictures of activities and saying, point to the boy has a ball, and you follow the same procedure. So, moving forward. So, testing description and formats. The Clinical Evaluation of Language Fundamentals, 5th edition, or CELF 5 as we know it, is a group of tests designed to assess, diagnose, and measure changes in language and communication in individuals 5 to 21 years of age. So it's not a one-trick pony. We're going to figure out not only does this child have a language deficit, but also what can we do to improve their communication. So it was created to identify not only weaknesses, but also strengths, and to determine service eligibility, as in figuring out if that child needs special education services. It provides intervention strategies and measures intervention efficacy. The CELF 5 assesses both oral and written language as well as nonverbal communication skills. So, the test does have 16 subtests, and they're listed here. I'm going to give a brief description of each of them, so bear with me, please. First off, we have the observational rating scale, which is basically where the parents or caregivers, teachers, and sometimes even the individual who's being assessed, they talk about the listening, speaking, reading, and writing behaviors of the individual being assessed, and they rate them. It has 40 items, and it's used across environments for ages 5 to 21. Then we have sentence comprehension, which has 26 items. This is only used for 5 through 8-year-olds, and it's about their understanding of grammatical rules at a sentence level. So in this one, they're required to identify one picture from a set of 4 that best represents an orally presented description, which I talked about in the previous slide. Then we have linguistic concepts, which has 25 items, and it's also only used for the 5 through 8-year-olds. It's about their ability to interpret and follow verbally presented instructions with logical operations. So basically, children are required to identify objects that correspond with the examiner's verbal descriptions. Next, we have word structure, which is a procedure with 33 items, again used for 5 to 8-year-olds, and it's about their ability to correctly use pronouns and apply English morphological rules. So what the children have to do is provide the ending to an incomplete sentence presented by the examiner with reference to 1 or 2 illustrations provided. Then we have word classes, which consists of 40 items that measure, again, 5 to 8-year-olds' ability to understand connections between words related by semantic features, function, place, or time. So essentially you'll have maybe a picture of a dog, a puppy, and a frog, and you'll have to figure out which ones are related, right? So initial items involve 3 to 4 pictured objects, whereas more challenging items involve 4 orally presented words, with examinees verbally identifying the 2 that are most similar. Then we have following directions, which consists of 33 items that measure 5 to 21-year-olds' ability to interpret, recall, and follow verbally presented directions. The examinees are shown 4 to 18 pictured objects and are required to point to the objects in the order described by the examiner. So they have to do it in that specific order. Formulated sentences has 24 items, and they examine a 5 to 21-year-old's ability to orally produce grammatically and semantically correct sentences of increasing length and difficulty using 1 to 2 stimulus words provided by the examiner and with reference to a presented illustration. All right, I have the next ones on the next slide. So, continuing. Recalling sentences, that was part of your do now. As we know, it has to do with the ability to attend to, recall, and reproduce sentences of increasing length and difficulty verbally presented by the examiner. This part of the test has 26 items. Next, there is understanding spoken paragraphs, which is composed of 20 items used for 5 to 21-year-olds' ability to attend to a short story and interpret the themes, details, order of events, and to make inferences and predictions. Word definitions has 21 items. It's used for only 9 years and up, and is about the ability to define words based on semantic features. Then we have sentence assembly, which is composed of 20 items, used again for 9 to 21-year-olds, and it's about the ability to assemble words and or groups into grammatically and semantically correct sentences. For semantic relationships, it is comprised of 20 items, again for 9 to 21-year-olds, and has to do with the ability to understand sentences based on comparative, spatial, temporal, and sequential information. So the examinees will select 2 multiple choice answers from a set of 4 in response to orally presented questions from the examiner. The pragmatics profile is comprised of 50 behavioral statements, and it forms a behavioral checklist that measures the 5 to 20-year-olds' verbal and nonverbal pragmatic language skills. Then we have reading comprehension, which consists of 16 to 19 items. It's only for the 8 through 21-year-olds, and it's to see their ability in understanding information presented in written paragraphs. So the student will independently read a written passage, and they're asked questions, 8 to 10 questions, regarding themes, order of events, details, inferences, and predictions. Then we have structured writing, which is comprised of 2 age-specific narratives, of which 18 to 20-year-old examinees read 1 complete sentence, complete a subsequent incomplete sentence, and write 1 to 4 additional sentences within the theme of the narrative. Finally, we have the pragmatics activity checklist, which consists of 32 statements that measure functional, verbal, and nonverbal communication skills, and the examiner engages in authentic social interactions with the examinee and documents the occurrence of particular nonverbal and verbal behaviors to get sort of an overview. So, as we know, the CELF 5 is comprised of 16 subtests. 12 of these subtests combine to create the core language score. Then there is the receptive language index, expressive language index, language content index, language structure index, and language memory index, which is described on the chart in the next slide. You guys can take a look at that. I'm probably not going to talk much about it. The CLS, or the core language score, is a measure of overall language performance, whereas the index scores provide more information about specific language skills. So, each test is age-specific, and so it includes different differential start points, sample items, and specific reversal and discontinue rules. So all of the items are scored as either 0, incorrect, or 1, correct, except for formulated sentences, which have a range of 0, 1, or 2 points, and recalling sentences, which has 0, 1, 2, or 3 points. The subtest scores are converted to scale scores, and then confidence intervals and percentile ranks can be determined off of that. The only part that works differently is the pragmatics activities checklist, because it uses criterion reference scores. So index scores are converted to standard scores and compared to determine any possible issues. And age equivalence and growth scale scores can also be determined for most of the subtests to see where students rank next to kids their own age and how much they may have changed or improved since testing previously. So here you guys can take a look at the subtests contributing to core and index scores by age. So the validity of the CELF. According to a 2017 study of language assessments, the CELF 5 was one of the assessments that presented the most evidence for psychometric soundness, and it was recommended for use. However, there are issues with its validity. So in terms of construct validity, it's very insufficient. There were only 67 children with language disorders in the sensitivity group, and those children could have easily had severe language disorders, intellectual disabilities, or autism spectrum disorder. So a sensitivity group made up of children with severe disabilities, it would be easy for them to score as disordered on any test to identify language disorders. So whether the test is valid, it has to be assessed with children in the low, average to moderately clinical evaluation of language fundamentals 5 disordered range, and we can't rely on the sensitivity and specificity information provided by this data. So then there's the concurrent validity, and in terms of being compared to other tests, the CELF 5 was compared to vocabulary tests, specifically the PPVT4 and the EVT2, and these tests are not themselves valid tests of language acquisition or ability. So even if the correlation happens, concurrent validity of the CELF 5 language test can't be determined by comparing to these tests. So due to insufficient comparison tests, the concurrent validity for the CELF 5 is insufficient. So reliability of the CELF is kind of wrought with insufficiencies as well. A test is considered reliable if its measurements are consistent and accurate or near the true value. So for test-retest reliability, it was calculated by administering the CELF 5 to the same students on 2 separate occasions and comparing their performance. Makes sense. However, the test is for students who are 5 to 21 years old, and they only tested up to age 16. So there's kind of a big chunk of kids who are missing. So correlation coefficients for composite scores of this group range between 0.83 and 0.90, and the minimum standard for test reliability is 0.90, so it was below that as well. So the test-retest reliability of the CELF 5 was considered insufficient due to the small sample size and the correlation coefficients being less than the accepted minimum standard. Then we have the inter-examiner reliability. So despite good inter-examiner reliability for 4 different CELF 5 tests, the overall inter-examiner reliability was determined to be insufficient due to lack of data on CELF 5 tests. So not enough data, they can't say that it's acceptable. Then we have inter-item consistency. Inter-item consistency is calculated using the split half method. So scores from the first half of the test are compared to scores on the second half of the test. And reliability measures for the test scores for students from the normative sample ranged from 0.75 to 0.98. And reliability for the composite and index scores for the normative sample ranged between 0.95 and 0.96. So a lot of these coefficients were below the acceptable standard. And while the reliability coefficients for the composite and index scores are acceptable, insufficient data regarding how these values were obtained means that inter-item consistency can't be considered sufficient. Then there was, for the LD group reliability, coefficients were ranged between 0.81 and 0.97, and for the LDR group reliability, coefficients ranged between 0.86 and 0.99. For ASD, it was 0.91 to 0.99. The majority of correlation coefficients are acceptable according to the standards in the field, but due to unclear diagnostic statuses and the small sample sizes, the reliability overall for the clinical groups was not sufficient. So, limitations and biases. There are several factors that contribute to the lack of content validity for the CELF 5. First, there is a lack of information regarding how individuals who participated were identified as typically developing or language impaired. The pilot sample also used sample sizes smaller than what is considered acceptable in the field, and in addition, information regarding the panel's level of expertise wasn't provided. So, biases. Children who are learning English as a second language may show similar characteristics to children with specific language impairments when assessed by language tests. So typically, developing students learning English as a second language can be diagnosed as having a language disorder, when in reality, they're showing signs of typical second language acquisition. This ends up being kind of a difficulty when administering the test, but you have to use discretion. Then, a child's performance on the CELF 5 may also be affected by the dialect of English that is spoken in their homes and communities. For example, children who speak African American English at home may end up saying a sentence differently than standard American English, which will lead them to omit words or use extra words, and these count as errors. Research also shows that students from lower social economic statuses have less vocabulary knowledge than those from higher social economic statuses, and therefore their smaller vocabularies can lead them to having difficulties on the test. Additionally, there's the problem of having prior experience or knowledge, and a child's performance on the CELF 5 may be affected by this. For example, if a kid from like a large city might not know the word giraffe, or someone from a very cold environment or a very hot environment might not know the word snowman. So both of these are low frequency vocabulary words for these students, and they may be contained within the test. This makes it difficult, again, for these students to do well. There are some advantages to the self-assessment. So no test is 100% accurate in its ability to correctly distinguish between children with and without language disorders. The standards that deem whether a test is accurate enough are as follows. A test that accurately identifies children with language disorders and those without language disorders is good if it is 90 to 100% accurate, fair if it is 80 to 89% accurate. So the self-assessment has a sensitivity of 0.97, which means that 3% of children with a language disorder will not be diagnosed, and 3% of children who do not have a language disability will be identified as such and referred for special education services. We did talk about sensitivity earlier and determined that it wasn't a valid determination based on sample sizes. So there's that. The self-assessment, however, is both flexible and comprehensive because it allows administrators to use only parts of the test that are deemed necessary. Additionally, the test is a quick and fairly easy way to determine the presence and possible impacts of a language disorder, as well as help to plan for future instruction. So here are my resources if you want to check them out. Thank you for listening to my presentation. Have a great day.